when it comes to T1, basically, I understand that their roster is basically complete, almost. I understand they are.
In
your
your opinion, have they filled the leadership void? In your humble opinion?
No.
Okay.
No.
Interesting.
That would be my opinion. From what I know, no. Genuinely, if I see any player on G2 play Omen, I will actually bet that they will lose every single match whenever that agent is ever played. It's honestly terrible. Like, it's actually ridiculous. I will always hate on that agent so much.
Our final guest for the show, someone who I chatted with briefly over DM because, I definitely thought that it would be good to get George involved at some point. George, mate, thanks for finally coming on board. You have been churning out a ton of work for Upcomer primarily recently, mate. So congrats to you for that. And yeah, good to have you here, mate. I want to start off. Right. Okay, cool. All right. Well, that's at least promising to hear on that end. See if that changes or not. But George, you have, I would argue you've probably been at the forefront of a lot of the reporting around some of our biggest roster shuffles that are happening right now in Valorant globally. You're about as lost in the source as it gets. So we're glad to have you on because we want to talk about two titans of yesteryear that are undergoing some significant rebuilding processes. Let's start by talking about T1, who were announced sort of way back when. We'll do a bit of history first. I'm sure you can contribute to that significantly. But when T1 were first announced, gentlemen, I address you all as a unit, there was quite a lot of hype around this roster for good reason.
I mean, you look at the beginning. Sorry, George. I'll just start from the get-go because when T1 was first announced, right? So the first iteration of this roster, it wasn't around really the food and crashies, in my opinion. It was more about, oh my gosh, it's like the iBuy powers. 3 of the 5 of that core is coming back into gaming. Skadoodle finally coming back after winning a major with Cloud9 and then kind of like disappeared a bit in terms of the competitive scene and was streaming a lot. AZK making a comeback. Brax continuing. Hey, he was a potential player in CSGO. Is he going to bring that same type of performance into Valorant? And then Food and Crashies are like, oh, up-and-comers in the CS scene, but then boom, look at who the superstars are now. But on paper, originally, this roster did look pretty good, George.
Yeah, I mean, the roster did look very good. I think one thing people aren't really mentioning when we talk about T1 is the fact that, you know, these are CS players, so they are going to adjust fairly well. But, you know, Food, Crashies, these kinds of players, they weren't at the highest level. And also Brax, he competed at the highest level, but it wasn't always consistently up there. You know, obviously he was banned, he wasn't able to compete in majors. And I think T1 sort of jumped the gun with these kinds of things. You know, there wasn't really a clear leader in these kinds of in this first iteration, I would say. Obviously they brought in Days later to sort of fix this, well, try and fix this issue. But I think most of the leadership mainly came from Fraud, in my opinion, when they had him as the coach, right? You know, he was the one with pretty much the most experience in terms of coaching, and you know, he played, you know, Counter-Strike for years. I don't even know how many years he's been playing. Probably more than I've been alive.
It was like 03, I want to say.
It's actually ridiculous. He's a veteran in the scene, and he was a great leader. And the problem with this T1 roster is that during their first iteration, it was very difficult for them to get going. Very, very difficult. Because of that leadership problem. And, you know, when you have these sort of players that don't really mesh well with the game, you know, they're not entirely the same level that they would have been at CS. You know, we've seen some players that are able to transition very easily, you know, Tens, for example. Already a very talented player in Counter-Strike, now probably arguably the best player in the world when it comes to Valorant, right?
Agreed.
T1, on the other hand, you know, it's not really been the same. So that's what I would say about the first iteration, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess at this point, so after Victor and Crashies kind of left, that's where you brought in Daze and Spider. Spider, I think, was one of those players, a Saya player, the one of those coming in from Overwatch. I was like, okay, it might be something cool to see him as a duelist at some point in this team because he's been such a good Widowmaker player in Overwatch, apparently, from what I've been hearing. So we see him coming into the roster right now, always playing Omen, barely playing a duelist. And then we had some very slow methodical type of like calling from T1 at that point too. So coming up to this point, then George, what's your thoughts of how this came about in the second iteration? Was it still the right solution?
It's like the spider skadoodle right? On Jet, then moved to breach, like a change in style. Yeah.
It's like, what happened to that part?
Well, I mean, when Dazed comes in, there's sort of this, I guess, this leadership challenge where you've got Fraud and you've got Dazed, and then you've got everyone else. You know, Brax used to be, I think he called for just a small time in Counter-Strike as well. You know, he has experience with these kinds of things, and it just became sort of a clash, in my opinion. I think there was ideological differences within the team. I think played quite a big part when it comes to the destruction of the roster, really, in my opinion. But when it comes to personal preference of agents, I've always never been a fan of Omen. I think he's a disgusting agent to even use. I think he's awful.
He's awesome.
I think he's terrible. I think he's not usable in any comp, really, when you've got better agents like Sky and Breach out there, but Viper, in my opinion. But this is the thing: when you have a player, that is good on a agent that doesn't actually matter, your position on the team comes under question a bit, right? But Spider is a very, very good player. Obviously, he is very talented. He's very, very talented. But the second iteration was always, I always thought it was good, but it wasn't like the highest level. It wasn't breaking into the upper echelon. It was never going to, right? Dazed is very much past his prime when it comes to these kinds of things. He's getting old now. He's not, at the same level as what he once was. And I don't think he's ever going to reach that ever again. That's my opinion. So yeah, I think they made a good choice at the time, but in hindsight, I think it was probably not the best move. In my opinion, I would say.
So, are Automatic and Curry at this point like the answer when you bring in Tim from Cloud9 with the tenure that he has in his Counter-Strike days?
See, again, it's more of these issues where you've got players from Counter-Strike who we don't know if they actually like the game yet. There are so many questions when you bring Counter-Strike players and you bring all these different sort of all these different players from different games. You don't know how well they're going to adjust, right? Automatic, I feel like, is one of those players that from when I watch him, I can just see that, do you actually enjoy playing this game? He loved Counter-Strike. He played, do you know what I mean? Like, I look at him and I think, you should be playing Counter-Strike. You're a Counter-Strike player. And I think for someone like Brax, it's a lot easier to sort of change over because I feel like, he's got this sort of streaming platform. He's got the ability to have his own voice. He's got his own brand. He's a very versatile player. He's always been known to be a very versatile player, especially when he came into teams in Counter-Strike like Cloud9 at CS Summit all those years ago. He's always proved that. And that's where I think Brax has shone in the past, in my opinion.
Yes.
There is a very, very, very big difference between Counter-Strike and Valorant, and the personal sort of feelings about the game can make a huge difference as to whether that player is actually going to be good at the game or just maybe above, maybe doing well, but not like, not a TenZ, not a Durka, no one like this, And you would expect Automatic to be that player, but he hasn't. So honestly, I wasn't too sure where they went from there.
Yeah, I wonder what's next for this team in terms of I mean, we've talked on this show at length about like the coaching decisions that have sort of been made, and how we talk about the stunner situation, and we spent a lot of time hanging shit on David Dennis, and frankly, I do it without evidence sometimes. I just love to give him shit. I'm sure one day he'll front up to me in an event and be like, "Why are you such a cunt to me?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know, honestly, I'm not really sure." But let's talk about the future then for this T1 team, because we can sort of discuss whether what they've got right now is enough or not. But if it ain't, then what is? What kind of trajectory do we feel like we're on with this T1 roster? Because there are a lot of people that are like wondering when they're going to be sort of back to that level of glory, who want to see someone like Brax really, or not anymore, but would have wanted to have seen Brax succeed in this shell, and now wonder where T1 go from here.
Well, I think Curry's a very good player, for example. I think they've certainly got a talented player right there. I think he was a very, very good pickup. I think, obviously, from my report, I understand that Dazed has been removed from the team. So that is a leader gone, right? That's it. There's no more leader in the side. And the problem is that now there's a void, right? There's a void where they need to find another leader, or there needs to be a new leader in the team, and someone needs to step up. Whether that will be someone like Curry, someone, you know, already on the roster, we don't know, right? But then obviously, as my initial report came out, I believe Spider was taking a break, hence why, or he had some sort of, I'm not sure what the actual situation was, but he just wasn't playing. That's why he was
like he cited some sort of
he was just out of the
mental
game.
health issues, but he was kind of burnt out, I think.
Yeah, that might have been one of the reasons. That's just speculation for now. But he wasn't playing with the roster for a time. But he's back, and now, you know, some people have suggested to me that perhaps he's not back, you know, full time. He could just, you know, be put on the bench. I don't know. But there are rumors, from what I know, of T1 potentially signing someone who I should be reporting on soon. You know, I still need to sort of
do an exclusive here.
I need to dot the I's when it comes to this, but from what I know, you know, I want to be a bit careful with what I say now, but T1 have almost secured their roster pretty much, is from what I know. I believe they are at the last stages of trialing players. I believe they are at the last stages of completing their roster. And I think that goes the same for basically every team in NA right now, obviously, because stage 3 starts either later this month or early next month, right? So they really need to sort of solidify their roster, and they need to do it soon. And I think the problem with this roster started with the removal of Fraud, and I think that left quite a large power vacuum, and that was really damning for the side, because when you have someone like Fraud, I always think he's reminiscent of somebody that has quite a good personality when it comes to speaking with players. From what I know, anyway, I feel like he has sort of leadership qualities that could be good if he was still a player. You know, he could be at the same level as like a Shazam if he was, you know, his age, or not, you know, not past his prime, for example. You know, Fraud back in the day was a fragger, right? So,
100%.
You know, back when I was playing with toys, this guy was, you know, shooting heads. So when it comes to T1, basically, I understand that their roster is basically complete, almost. I understand they are. In your opinion,
have they filled the leadership void? In your humble opinion,
no.
Okay.
No.
Interesting.
That would be my opinion. From what I know, no. But there is room for said players to step up and sort of fill that leadership void. Whether David is going to step up himself and, you know, provide this kind of leadership is yet to be seen, in my opinion. But yeah, so T1 are pretty much secure from what I know. So
okay. Well, then, I'm curious to see who gets announced, because I know there's going to be we'll talk about it on the show. I'm sure there'll be plenty of criticism if it's not like an instant fix as far as the layman is concerned, and it doesn't sound like it will be. Let's go across the pond here. All right, Mitch, here's your time to shine. Let's talk about the history, the storied and decorated history of G2 and how they started out. Jeez, we're going back a while now. These guys were the shit early on in European Valorant. What happened, Mitch?
Oh yeah, they were, man. Oh yeah, one year, one roster change, and they were winning absolutely everything. Like, it was the fact that they stuck together. You look at this team. I have no fucking idea how this happened. You know, in terms of the personalities on that team, never gonna work was my initial thought. I looked at the individuals. Have most of them performed at a high level? No, it's never gonna fucking work. And somehow they found that sweet spot in the early days. They were absolutely amazing to watch. Their reads, I'll tell you, the best thing about G2 was watching them on round to round, like their mid-round. For a team that didn't have a distinct leadership, that didn't have a dedicated IGL. And that was the other thing that kind of blew us away. We were all like, maybe Mixwell is taking it on board, right? Maybe like Pith from the Sentinels are going to be doing a bit. When we had a chat with these guys and they were like, yeah, we don't really have an IGL. We just kind of, whoever feels it calls it round to round. It's like, fuck you, man. You don't get to be the best team in Europe. Just do whatever some dude calls out. And in fact, if you watch some of the VODs, and from what I'd heard from a couple of different people, was that at times a couple of people would have ideas, and it would be whoever shouts the loudest was the one that got followed. And somehow that worked. That pisses me off. It shouldn't, but it did. And these guys, like the reads that they had, and this was where the benefit of the different backgrounds they had within their individual scenes came in. They were all blindly confident in what they were calling and in what they were seeing. They would read you like a book. They would adapt to you. They were like fish in water. There was no way for you to predict what these guys were going to do. Because if you ask them, what are you going to do in the mid-round? They don't fucking know. They haven't got a clue. Whoever shouts the loudest is going to be listened to. I couldn't believe that this team got the success that they did. And we always cautioned, though, especially in a game like Valorant. It was at the Allied Esports Ignition Series that I first heard it from a Riot employee that there were going to be two new maps, every year, and 6 new agents. And that's when we were cautioning, if you don't have a coach, if you don't have a dedicated IGL, if you don't have some sort of structure, adapting to those changes is going to be very, very difficult. And we always sold the narrative in all of these Ignition events that this was a time-limited thing. And it was even backed up by Mixwell. I remember messaging him at one stage, and we were just talking about a couple of games and how the game went. He gave me a lot of insight from his side on how they played the game. But he said that it wasn't like everybody has this narrative of why don't they get a coach? Why don't they? They were looking for a coach. They were trialing it. But I challenge you to look at that 5-man, the original roster they had, and see any personality that fits in there. There's almost no room for it with the guys that you had. And so now, obviously, they've got Neil Zeno, they've got El Royo coming in as an analyst as well. They're starting to apply that structure and look to fix the things that we knew were going to be a constraint on them over time. But the story of this team in the early days and the success they had for how long they had it, it blows my mind. It really does, because you just look at it, and at every single corner, every turn they should have failed, and somehow they never did.
And to add on to that, to look at G2's evolution right now, and I wanted to get your opinion, because we talked about it before, George, before you came onto the show, between the three of us, that looking between the trade of like G2 and Heretics from like Artis and Patitech with Nuke and Avova, who do you think comes out a winner out of this one? Was it more of like a money transaction that Heretics comes out on top and they're looking for a long-term build? Because at least we believe that short-term, they're not going to get the success that we expected for them to get, or we expect for them to get.
You know, I would actually argue nobody won. I think that's my opinion. I don't think G2 have actually made the correct decisions, in my opinion. I think they have made some good moves, but I think in terms of the overall decisions they've made, it looks like a very sort of it's not addressing the problem, in my opinion. Now, the problem with G2 is the personalities on the side, as you know, Mitch mentioned. They replaced a few personalities with a few more personalities, right? So we've got this balance now where Mixwell, who has arguably the most amount of power on the roster, you know, he was basically the golden child who was saved, from the wrath of Carlos, and whether he would be removed or not. Obviously, you know, you can't remove Mixwell. You know, he's an immovable object at this point. Sure. But that's one of the problems, right? When you've got this immovable object who has this power over the roster, you know, you add personalities, and that's a bit of a problem. I don't think G2 will ever get back to the level as they once were, because I think, as Mitch mentioned, I would completely agree with him, actually. I would say at the start of the game, nobody really knew what they were doing, right? It was a very new game. People were still adjusting to it. Compositions were awful. You know, people were playing, for example, Omen, terrible agent, never should be played ever again.
Omen, stop it!
God, I actually hate it. You know, people were actually playing him, for example. And now that we're getting these new agents, these new maps, it'll be very, very hard to adjust. But I think with the recent changes of adding Neil, for example, I think that's definitely a positive. But personalities are always the problem. So, in my opinion, it would be G2 that kills G2 if it was to end that way. Heretics, on the other hand, I would say have potential. Whether they can reach the upper echelon is really another question for me. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure about the roster. Because from what I know, they have sort of picked up the pieces a little bit. Which could be a good thing, you know, it could be a good thing in one sense. But I think they do have a solid roster. But again, to compete with the likes of Team Liquid, Fnatic, these kinds of teams, FPX, for example, you need to be able to strategically outplay these teams, right? We saw, I believe, Team Liquid had some of the best strategies when I saw Masters. Fnatic as well, obviously boaster, incredible IGL. I think he's very underrated. And now we sort of get to this impasse where you need to be able to match the strategies, if not beat the strategies of these teams that are constantly evolving with new agents, new maps, and a meta that will change basically every week. So, you know, we have this sort of post-plant meta, for example, right now. But then, you know, after season 3, everything will change again. You know, Yoru buffs most likely come in, and then, you know, everything will change basically. So I honestly don't know, but if G2 was to die, it would be at the hands of G2. That would be what I would say about that.
What do you make of this news that Pit is not scrimming with G2 presently?
Yeah.
Yes. So as far as I'm aware, Pith has not been scrimming with G2. That's correct. He has been streaming, I believe, in the meantime. Yeah. So I think they are trying to switch the roles a bit. I believe Mixwell was seen on basically every agent under the sun. I think he played like Viper, Killjoy. Omen. I think you. Yeah, I hope not Omen. Dear God. if I actually genuinely, if I see any player on G2 play Omen, I will actually bet that they will lose every single match whenever that agent is ever played. It's honestly terrible. Like, it's actually ridiculous. I will always hate on that agent so much. But no, so I believe they trialed Shed, and I believe they trialed Masashi, I believe is how his name's pronounced.
Yeah, Masashi.
German, yeah, German player.
German, sorry.
Yeah, again, it's one of these situations where, you know, G2 could potentially find an insane duelist. For example, I think Shed's incredible.
Do they need an insane duelist? In your opinion?
I think so. I would think that they need that player to be able to take over. I think Mixwell's good, but I believe Mixwell could be better if he was on that sort of secondary caller kind of, you know, controller.
Wouldn't Nokia? So you would want Nokia and a replacement to be on the duelist role. I think it's, who was it that said that they wanted that they thought that Mixwell was too smart to play Jet?
I can't remember. Maybe a journalist. I'm not sure. Might have been Nell. I'm not sure. But yeah, so I would agree that Mixwell is too smart to play a duelist. I think he has the potential to be a very good controller or sentinel, in my opinion. I think Viper, especially. Not Omen. Any agent other than Omen, I would be happy to see Mixwell on. That is totally fine.
Pull him out.
Honestly, that would be amazing. But yeah, so, you know, that's what I'd say about that. I mean, you could potentially pick up another duelist, but, you know, I don't believe 2 duelists in any. I mean, hell, I mean, I heard that they were playing Yoru in scrims. Like, for God's sake, guys, come on, you know. These kinds of things are never going to work. I think Yoru's an awful agent, and whether he will actually get buffed, I think he is getting buffed.
Yoru, I think, is supposed to be
getting I think buffed, he is getting buffed. So fair enough, maybe they were preparing for that, but even so, it was a terrible decision. So yeah, I think G2 are in a positive state, but if they were to get maybe more of a balanced player that can actually find frags and can reach the potential of the roster as a whole, then yeah, I think it'll be a good change. But you know, whether Piff was the answer or not, I don't know. I really don't know.
I still want to know though, if you know the numbers, who won out of that transaction between G2 and Heretics, right? Because I want to get down to that.
Well, are you asking who came out financially ahead?
Exactly. Because it feels like for Heretics, they had more to they had more to gain from G2, right? Because G2 want to spend more to get Nuki and Navova away from Heretics. Because in the first in the first rumored articles, it seemed as though that Heretics weren't ready, and they weren't. It was implied that the roster wasn't even going to blow up at some point because they're like, we're good with the roster that we have right now. And G2 apparently is like, fuck it, we want those 2 players. So it would feel that they forked out more money to get those 2 players on top of Artis and Patty.
Pretty safe, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the way G2 works is what G2 wants, G2 gets. That's very much how it works, because G2 has the power to basically do pretty much anything. They have the money, they have the power. And when an organization like Heretics, arguably much smaller than G2, is, you're able to sort of leverage that, right? But when you get an offer to go to G2, you take it, right? It's one of the largest organizations in Europe, arguably the largest, right? So, that is something I think should be mentioned, at least, that what G2 wants, G2 basically gets. They have an overwhelming amount of power, especially with Mixwell as the lead of the roster. He's, one of the most well-known players, especially from CS as well. So yeah, I think that's a good and a bad thing. Whether I believe they will keep it up, I'm not sure. But I think if Mixwell was to be placed on a Sentinel or controller, I think it'd be better for the side. So yeah, I think basically G2, I genuinely think G2 were the better to sort of come out of it. But financially at least, because G2 basically, what they do is they get these players and then they become really good and then they just leave for a load of money, right? That's just how G2 sort of churns these players out. And I think if you were to pick up someone like Shed or Musashi, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but even so, if you were to get 2 of these players or either one of them, then you would have a player that you can easily make money on in the future, because these are talented players. And it's like when I saw the moves from Fnatic when they signed Magnum and Durka. I originally had a conversation with a few friends of mine, and we were talking about how absolutely incredible this Durka guy was. No one really knew him, coming from the CIS scene. He wasn't really that known. But he was putting up numbers. He was putting up solid numbers in arguably one of the most competitive regions. So I think G2, if they were to make a change, they would come off as the better financially. I would say that.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic. Some great insight there, George. Mate, thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to come and chat with us as well. I know it's not always easy because you have a lot of information. You have to be pretty judicious in how you distribute it.
So
no worries, mate. What's where can people find you? If those wanting to know how they themselves can be lost in the source in the Valorant scene, where might they come across your work?
Obviously I write for Upcomer right now. It's a new esports publication owned by Enthusiast Gaming. Or you can basically just follow my Twitter. That's where I post everything. So it's George and then a C and then Ged, which is short for Gedis, my last name. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, we'll keep an eye out for more developments coming out of both G2 and T1, but of course,
stay tuned. Stay tuned. Yeah. T1, hopefully soon.
I'm waiting for that to drop, George. I'm licking my lips to see exactly what direction they're going, because you've set my expectations down a little bit there. Vans, Mitch, great to have you guys on. It's been quite the show. Thank you. And of everyone in chat, apologies to Ron, Rust, and Silver. Can't get to all your questions because we've gone over time with this particular show. But great to have you all back here for another episode of Valoranting. We'll be back next week, Tuesday, of course, 11 a.m. PDT, with some more action. We've got plenty of stories developing that we're going to be circling back, discussing plenty of stuff coming from Riot themselves, the developer, and looking ahead to some of tournaments in the near future. Thanks for joining us, everybody. See you next week.